Hey, it's Daddy Ray. That's how you answer the phone, right?
Yeah. That's how I start every conversation or end it.
Hey, it's Big Daddy Ray.
That's right, yeah.
What do you say? Welcome back to the Cold War episode 285.
Right.
On our last episode, we talked about the first president of the pseudo-republic of Cuba, Estrada, ran a rigged election for his re-election in 1905, 1906. Rebels stormed the government offices. He quit and walked away with his cabinet because they didn't have an army to defend themselves. The Americans had to step back in. Brought 5,000 Marines to protect U.S. property, built a Cuban standing army, and then there was new elections and in 1908, and José Miguel Gómez was elected finally, his third time lucky, as the president of Cuba. He forced the U.S. troops and Magoon and Crowder, the guys that were the governor and military commander, respectively, to leave the country in 1909. But before he left, Mr. Magoo, as a parting gift to the Cuban people, issued a whole bunch of lucrative Cuban contracts to U.S. firms.
Nice. Okay.
And, well, just, giving them off control of most of Cuba. And it didn't stop with him either. As it turned out, Gómez was just as happy to award contracts to American firms if the price was right. Anyway, several months later, Mr. Magoo received an official commendation from President Taft, who was the president at this stage, for his excellent service in Cuba. Yeah. Gómez ruled until 1913, was apparently very well liked by the people, viewed as sort of a kind president in the eyes of the people, but a lot of political corruption during his presidency, several major scandals. He began funding newspapers that would take pro-government positions. And then in 1909, he signed a decree establishing the Cuban Telephone Company, which was a US-based company.
Right.
And basically controlled it. Was rolled into ITT in the 1920s. So you had Americans controlling the Cuban telephony system. And if people have seen The Godfather Part 2, there's a great scene when Michael Corleone is in Havana. It's in the late 50s. And he's at a meeting that's being run by the president of Cuba. It's not actually said as Fulgencio Batista, but that's who it's supposed to be.
Right.
And he says, our friends from the telephone company have presented me with this telephone made of solid gold, and they're passing it. He's got all the heads of industry of Cuba there, and Michael Corleone is there with Hyman Roth, and they're because the mafia are quite happy about what they've built, and they're sort of planning on sort of taking over Cuba largely.
Right.
Michael, we will be bigger than U.S. Steel. They're trying to get their own little country, not unlike a lot of American billionaires are trying to do now, build their own country in Greenland. But they're passing. It's a great scene if you haven't seen it. They're passing the gold phone around, and everyone's like, "Ooh, ah!" And they give it to Michael Corleone, and he just passes it on. He doesn't even look at it. He could not give a fuck.
That's not why I'm
not
here.
Interested in the bling. Yeah, he's not interested in the bling.
Quiet power. Quiet. That's what he wants. Is quiet power. Yeah. But could I mention you at the end of the last episode? You mentioned that they made a statue of Estrada. And eventually it was torn down and just the feet that are still there. There was also going to be another statue. General Wood, before he left, commissioned a giant statue of Jesus. Who can't get behind that? It was going to be on one of the coastlines of Havana. And what it is it was supposed to welcome the poor, huddled masses from Europe to Cuba. Wait, dramatic pause. The white masses, because again, before the Spanish left, officially, they had just gotten this close to whitening Cuba. And now that's being picked up again by the Cuban authorities who know what the Americans want. So again, it's to bring Europeans for various different reasons, obviously to work, but we want the right kind of Europeans. We want the white Europeans. So again, the people of Cuba, the black soldiers who fought and died and bled, they see all this, they know what's going on, and they're just getting more and more pissed. And now those U.S. troops aren't there anymore. So we're going to see what happens. But the point is, these people have got the deck stacked against them from the second they're born. And now they're having to take on the might in its many forms of the United States of America. It sucks to be some of them at this point.
President Gómez apparently had the nickname of the shark, tiburon.
Ooh, I like that.
Because when he swims, he splashes. And this was apparently a reference to the fact that he shared and handed out many public offices and posts to friends and relatives.
Right.
He shared the wealth. Now, Cuba remained a typical settler society. Cubans ran the politics, but the white colonists from Spain and the USA controlled commerce and industry and the retail trade, as well as the professions like the newspapers and the schools.
And the telephone.
So they had and the telephone. They had a lock in the sugar industry. They had a lock on what really mattered in Cuba. You can fuck around with the politics all you like. You can, elect who you like within reason.
Yeah, exactly.
But we have a lock on what really matters. The money, the army, the media, the education system. That's where it really counts, right?
Exactly.
According to the U.S. consul in 1911, the value of U.S. nationals who were resident in Cuba was estimated at $205 million, and that's 1911 US dollars. So it was a big chunk of the country that US nationals owned in Cuba.
Yeah. That's why you take islands. Making that money.
A census back in 1899 had revealed that 20% of the male adult population of Cuba were white foreigners. And one of those was Angel Castro, father of Fidel Castro.
Oh, nice.
He'd come over from Spain. They were relatively recent immigrants to Castro. Fidel was born there, but his father was an immigrant.
Right.
But some of the white immigrants also caused problems for the new government. Not all of the white immigrants were rich landowners. Some of the ones coming in from Europe were anarchists or anarcho-syndicalists. They weren't all necessarily pro-rich white landowners, although a lot of them were, but some of them had different ideas. In the early years of the Republic, the official mood was white supremacy, and that resulted in a large population of unhappy Black Cubans who, as we've said in previous episodes, provided the bulk of the troops in the independence war, but ended up with nothing to show for it. The colonial society was racist, and many of the great black generals had died in the Revolutionary War.
Yes.
So new leaders started to emerge who wanted to defend the black community. They mostly came from the middle class. They were aspiring politicians. They tried to devote themselves to the promotion of education and integration, to prohibit racial segregation in public places, and a ban on discrimination in employment. They were largely unsuccessful, although they did sort of end segregation in the new artillery force that was put together. But there was a growing sense of disillusionment in the black communities throughout the country. And this is going to be a big part of the continued revolutionary atmosphere in Cuba right through until the Castro Revolution. Arthur Schomburg, who's a black American historian, visited Cuba in 1905. He wrote, "During the colonial days of Spain, the Negroes were better treated enjoyed a greater measure of freedom and happiness than they do today.
Wow.
Many Cuban Negroes were welcomed in the time of oppression, but in the days of peace, they are deprived of positions, ostracized, and made political outcasts. The Negro has done much for Cuba. Cuba has done nothing for the Negro.
That's so true. And it's only going to get worse. Before we go on, because the blacks are about to take matters into hand. But before we do that, when I got to the part about the anarchists, I don't know much about them. I never really studied that. And so I looked up, anarchists from Spain, and I just got a ton of information. I'm like, okay, whoa. And I searched anarchists from Spain in Cuba. Too much information, because I just wanted to give a little blurb or something like that. So then I look up Spanish anarchists in Cuba, just the first 10 years of the new century, and it was still too much. So here's what I got: there were just some people, and these were trained agitators. They weren't just assholes. They weren't just antisocial. They knew, they had practiced, they had studied the science of disrupting, whether it's business, whether it's government functions. They weren't just jerks or hotheads, and they had anarchists in case the church treated the poor. Cruelly, which they did. They had anarchists when the government treated the poor cruelly, which they did. They even had anarchists for people who criticized people who wanted to live a polyamorous life. Just free love, whatever. I find you attractive, male, female, whatever, or whatever you are. I want a piece of that kind of thing, which is what I said to you when we met in Vegas. But the point is, they even had anarchists. They had their own anarchists protecting them who would fuck someone's shit up for saying something about them in public. I mean, these people, little crazy, little loco in La Cabeza, but they were good at it. And they did make some people's lives in Cuba, the elites, very difficult, to the point that they started, and this is no surprise, they started creating their own little worlds. They had their own schools, they had their own churches, they had their own hospitals, they had their own social set. I mean, it truly was not just black and white, but it was literally, they were getting further and further apart as the years went by. And the blacks are getting very angry at this.
I think anarchy gets a bad rap in modern terms. Like it's kind of come to mean something that it didn't mean during the period of the Enlightenment. If you go back and read guys like Proudhon, who was the first person, I think, to self-identify as an anarchist.
Right.
It was him and guys before him like Kant, Burke, talked about anarchy in the sense of returning to a state of nature, where you didn't need a monarchy or you didn't need a government. People just, lived according to nature, lived with each other, made their own agreements between each other. Anarcho-syndicalism is a step up from that. I've always thought anarcho-syndicalism is a good idea. It's where you have little communities of people, like your immediate neighborhood, where you all meet and agree amongst each other about how you're going to run your local community, like a local council. And there's no elections really, but you just decide amongst yourselves who's going to be the spokesperson. There's no one with power, but you'll have a spokesperson for the community. Right. And then the spokespeople of the various communities in a region meet and discuss, negotiate, have diplomacy about what they want for that bigger region. It goes all the way through the country, where you have just people who get together and talk about what do we want, how do we want to do it, what makes sense for us as a group of people. But there's no government that's overarching and making rules and making laws.
Oppressing.
People just sort of do it for themselves locally.
Sounds good.
But anarchy then became sort of this negative term to mean, I guess, disorder and destruction and violence and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But it wasn't necessarily the way that political philosophers in the 19th and early 20th century really thought of it. And I think it was deliberately positioned by the media and governments in the West to like communism and socialism was portrayed in the West to mean some sort of oppressive, authoritative form of a repressive government. which it isn't.
Right.
It can be implemented that way, but so can capitalism and democracy, is
like it is now.
Americans are learning very quickly. Yeah. It doesn't have to be that way. It wasn't.
Right.
That's not part of the core ideas of Marx and Engels, etc. Same with anarchy. You know, it people can use violence to try and make a case for the return to a state of nature, but that's not necessarily what anarchy means or how it's defined or how it has to be represented.
Right.
Anyway, back to the Negroes of Cuba. So a new political party was formed for the black population. It was called a Partido Independiente de Color.
Ooh, I like that.
The PIC, the Independent Colored Party.
Right.
And it attacked white supremacy, called for abandonment of the whites-only immigration policy and dropping the ban on black immigration. And the whites, again, started to fear a Haiti-style revolution. So the white-run newspapers started to attack the new party. And one of the leaders of the PIC was a guy called Estenoz, who was arrested in 1910. The newspaper that he had created to promote the political party was seized and shut down. The party was threatened with closure. Hundreds of blacks were arrested across the country and justified by the white-run newspapers, claiming the blacks were threatening white women. That's how you...
Just that's your go-to.
That's how you do it. Yeah.
That's right. If
Look,
my
they're
wife
threatening
is nervous,
white women.
I have to arrest you all. Can I just read one thing that he wrote in August of 1908? I'll keep this short, but I just thought it was, this would scare old Whitey, because it scared me. He says, freedom is not asked or begged for. It is won. The rights are not handed out anywhere. Rights are fought for and belong to all. If we go on asking for our rights, we will die waiting because we will have lost them. And this is my favorite part. Faith kills the spirit when we have faith in others rather than in ourselves, because it kills initiative. If you're waiting for someone else to save you, you're never going to be saved. You got to do it yourself. And again, it's not like they're taking out machetes and killing everybody. They're literally calling for laws to go, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't have public segregation. We're all on the same island together. I mean, it's stuff like that, which, we were doing that in the 1960s. So, but the point is, they were calling for a better treatment, a more fair treatment, and that freaked Whitey out to no end.
Yeah, and a law was passed in 1908 called the Morua Law, which basically banned parties based on race.
Yeah, can't do that. Yeah.
So Estenoz was eventually released from prison, and the rest of the prisoners were put on trial, found not guilty, and released. But the damage had been done. It was obvious that you couldn't have a political party that was going to fight for the rights of the black population of Cuba without everyone being arrested.
Exactly.
So Estenoz decides to try the Platt card. And get the US involved in this. He forwarded a petition to the President of the United States requesting an appointment and was told to go fuck himself. We're not going to let a darky from Cuba meet with the president. Are you kidding me? How would that look? How's that going to track? What are the visuals? Think of the optics.
And if you did, you'd have to come around the back door. I can't stress that enough. But you're not welcome. So because basically what he said was,
you told me I'm always welcome in your back door.
That's again,
I'm confused.
Metaphor. I'll send you the diagram again. So, but Ernesto said, look, get rid of this law or we fight. And that triggers, I guess, the Platt Amendment.
Yes. And he didn't get a meeting with the president, who was still Taft at the time, but a U.S. minister in Havana did write some communique to Washington, basically said, look, the blacks have been part of the civil wars and that kind of stuff, but they had white leadership. here's the thing. Like, without the whites, the blacks can't do anything by themselves. Listen, I spoke to Jesus about this, and he told me,
white Jesus,
as a white man to white man, that the blacks can't do anything without white leadership. You don't have to worry. It's no problem.
Oh my God, I'm uncomfortable. Right. So they even took credit for fighting away from the black man. Goddamn. Just goddamn. Anyway, but the point is the Marines are on their way. There's gonna be something.